The MENA Talks, a podcast series by the BIC on the Middle East and North Africa. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will explore underlying historical, economic, social and political drivers behind today's systemic issues in the MENA region. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special episode on Afghanistan of the MENA Talks Podcast. My name is Shada Islam, and I'm a senior commentator on geopolitics at the BIC. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Jawed Ludin, who is the president of the think tank Heart of Asia Society and former Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan. Many thanks for being here, Jawed, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Shada. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So, Jawed, it's been 4 fraught and very difficult weeks since the United States and its NATO allies completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. America's longest forever war has come to a rather shambolic end, and the repercussions of that will be felt for years to come around the world, but especially, of course, in Afghanistan. The Taliban are now installed in Kabul and have set up an interim government. For weeks, Afghanistan was headline news, and most of the focus was on American and Western views on whether or not America has lost geopolitical credibility, if Russia and China are moving into the geopolitical vacuum, and whether terrorists were now going to start using Afghanistan once again as a base for attacking the West. But now you can see global attention is already focused on other crises, namely the transatlantic rift over the newly set up trilateral security alliance between the US, Britain, and Australia. We have short attention spans. But you and I know, Jawed, that for Afghans and for Afghanistan and its neighbors, the crisis is by no means over. So let's try and look at Afghanistan from a regional context, from a regional geopolitical context. Can the regional players get their act together?
Well, that was a very good summary, and the short answer, sadly, is, and again speaking from experience, not so. But because I think the region, the failure in Afghanistan is only partly the failure of the Afghans themselves, or the Americans for that matter. Or generally the Western coalition that was in Afghanistan basically for the last 20 years. It's also primarily a regional failure. Afghanistan's conflict was never really for the last, and let's look at it a little beyond the last 20 years of the American engagement. It has been running many years longer than that, and from the outset, whether it was from the Cold War times, with the Soviet invasion and afterwards, it was never really an Afghan conflict. It was a conflict of regional dimensions with significant global involvement. But for a long time, one fundamental reason that was missed from the US-led international strategy to stabilize Afghanistan and to essentially to win the war against terrorism, but at the same time stabilize Afghanistan and succeed, was precisely the dimension that you referred to, which is the regional element. They ignored the fact that the Taliban were being regrouped, supported, harbored, and provided with mobilization and backup from sanctuaries in Pakistan. By the time they did actually know that this was going on, and it was not very difficult to know, then they were unable to deal with it because they were hugely dependent on Pakistan for their supplies to inside Afghanistan, but also because they had such fraught relationships with other countries in the region that there was no alternative for them other than Pakistan. With Iran, for example, the relationship was very, very bad. In the north, Russia was initially supportive of the US engagement in Afghanistan, but soon grew worried about the real intentions of the American presence. The Chinese were not very supportive from the outset, even though they stayed quiet and looked on. So really, they couldn't deal with it, and they didn't deal with it, and that's why ultimately I think it came back to haunt the American engagement. That the Taliban were impossible to defeat because they had this rather secure backup base in Pakistan to which they could fall back in the event of being pressurized. And then in the very recent years there was this hope that be as it may, that the Americans were now on their way out, that perhaps the region could, if the region couldn't be part of the solution in the war effort, perhaps they could be part of the solution in the peace effort. And that's why the peace process that was that started in Doha, in Qatar, there was a huge expectation from everyone that some sort of a regional consensus could be built to bring the Taliban to a negotiating table and then eventually to support a negotiated political settlement. The region, for reasons that maybe we can discuss further in this conversation, was unable to really be mobilized behind a political settlement, and ultimately the political settlement broke down, and we saw a military takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. So really, basically, in a nutshell, the region has not been able to get its act together, and various phases of opportunities which Afghanistan had over the years, and I'm talking beyond the past 20 years of American engagement, even before that. And it's partly because of the precisely as you mentioned, the geopolitics of the region. It's a fragmented region. It's you take any two countries in Afghanistan's near and extended neighborhood, and they're bound to have some sort of tensions between them. It's very hard to find sort of congruence of interests, and therefore, when you have a conflict like Afghanistan that has no way other than to, for everyone to have a stake, and for everyone to be able to agree to a future that they could live with. Now that kind of a consensus was never possible to build, and sadly, even now, even though there is a military sort of victory now, when the Taliban are fully in control for the time being, it will be this very fact of the regional fragmentation that would, that could become easily a driver of prolonged war, and perhaps an even bigger sort of proxy civil war that could drag in the whole region.
Yeah. So you're painting a very, very worrying picture. And I think, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember, Jawed, I was a reporter then when there were these NATO meetings taking place, and we were discussing, the leaders and the ministers were discussing Afghanistan. People, I have to say, the Western mindset was so naive. I mean, they hardly knew the geography or the history of Afghanistan. They actually went into it rather unprepared, no lessons learned from the Soviet era in Afghanistan, and quite, I would say, naive about Pakistan's security interests and how deeply wedded the Pakistani establishment and the army and the military services were to that strategic depth argument that was being used. And also unaware, I mean, I have to say, I found it rather unsettling about Indo-Pakistan rivalries and how they were going to play out in Afghanistan. And now, of course, you've mentioned the peace process and the political settlement, but there again, I mean, surprising that the Afghan government in those days, of course, it was Ashraf Ghani, were not part of it. So I think you're absolutely right. And of course, now Islamabad is feeling a bit of a pushback also because the Pakistan Taliban obviously are quite encouraged and incentivized by the victory of their brothers in Kabul. So it's really quite messy, and you're right to be quite pessimistic. But I was wondering, is there any sense that common interest, because this region is, of course, has enormous natural resources, people are talented, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of economic benefits that could come from peace and stability in Afghanistan. And, cooperation between these countries could be really a moment of, how would I say it, a moment of real defining moment where we would have some development across the region. Do you see any of the regional leaders, including the Gulf, coming together with some sense of common purpose for sustainable development, for their people, for the women, the education of the country, etc.? Do you see that?
I wish I could. And but sadly, the trends are still very negative. In fact, the several sets of bilateral acrimonious relationships that you have in the region, and they have huge impact on how whether it's possible for some sort of congruence of interest to be built. Those relationships are still continuing. The India-Pakistan sort of dyadic issue that you mentioned is one of them. It has played out in Afghanistan in a huge way. I don't know. I mean, some will obviously if you speak to Indians, they would say they never played it, and it was only obviously a Pakistani paranoia about Indian presence that was, and I think there's significant truth in that. Nonetheless, the effect was the same, that whether it was only one player making it an issue or both players playing it out, the effect on Afghanistan was the same. But that's not the only one. You have had the long-standing Iranian-American relationship that is, and there is no prospect for that to change in the near future. You have now an increasingly problematic global rivalry we are seeing between China and the US, and especially with the new developments like the Pacific developments that you mentioned, one of the examples. This could get only worse. Russia obviously has always seen itself as in a rival's position with regard to anything that had to do with American presence in the region, and also I think nothing really helpful could also be seen beyond the region and a little bit of the extended neighborhood. So the economic factor was, over the last 20 years, was promoted quite a lot to see if this could serve as a counterbalance for the geopolitical fragmentation. And it could be used as a counterbalance for political divisions and differences, and you could use it as a unifying factor. But unfortunately, again, it was proven that unless you really bring political sort of consensus, that economic activity is going to always be subservient to political considerations. And that's why none of the major infrastructure projects that were seen to have transformational effect on regional connectivity, they have not actually happened yet. A lot has been said about CASA 1000, a lot's been said about the TAPI pipeline project and railroad networks that could connect and could have make Afghanistan as the roundabout of Asia, as they used to call it. But they haven't actually materialized. There's some are under progress. There's some have taken more steps perhaps than others. But the reality is that transformation has not come. And I would say once again, I think the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan really highlights one thing, and that is that the region still remains extremely vulnerable to extremist threats. You mentioned the Pakistani Taliban, but I would also say that I think this applies to several extremist elements from the whole region that will feel buoyed and encouraged by this victory, and now that the American, I think if there is anything, I mean, I know I've been painting about the negative picture, but if there is any sort of silver lining in all of this, that would probably come from the fact that the US is now out of the picture. And some of these regional powers, or even global powers like China and Russia, India, they will see that something has to now be done, and that the responsibility is theirs now, unlike the past 20 years when they really sort of stood on the fences and then watched the Americans deal with it. Now that they're fully out, then maybe they will do something about it, about the fact that unless you really engage very closely, unless you make sure that this situation doesn't get out of hand and that it doesn't lead to the strengthening of extremist forces in the entire region. It doesn't have an impact on destabilizing the region as a whole. It doesn't lead to floods of migrants pouring over the borders into different countries. And it doesn't also create a permanent state of instability and conflict in Afghanistan. So for all those reasons, let's just get our act together and let's organize. And then you can use, in that kind of context, you can use economic incentives or economic connectivity as a factor of unity. But that has to be seen now.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, with your colleague Janan Mosasai and we did write a piece for BIC about a month ago, actually before the fall of Kabul, about the regional connectivity plans and how the potential there was for economic dynamism and a sort of revival of the Silk Road, in a sense, with Afghanistan playing the role as it did in the past of a crossroads, a hub. And, there are some very good projects out there. There's even money for some of those projects, I think. But of course, there has to be political will. And Jawed, there has to be security, which brings me to the question, and, you've talked about it, how extremists from across the region, Al-Qaeda, IS, but also Uyghur extremists and, others could be active there. And that, of course, means that the region's governments, however much they may dislike or be reluctant to do so, actually have to engage with the Taliban. And the Taliban have now completed the task of setting up an interim government. So I was just wondering, are the Taliban ready for the business of governing Afghanistan? And are other regional players, apart from Pakistan, of course, which has, I think, recognized the Taliban government, will there be engagement with the Taliban in the region? And do you think from outside also, just because who else is there to talk to?
On whether the Taliban are prepared, I think the signs are that they were as shocked as anybody else by how this military victory became possible for them, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that they clearly appear to be unprepared for governing. I think partly to do with Taliban's own sort of nature as a movement and as a group. They have always been and have never had the opportunity to do. They've always been a military machinery, and they've not had an opportunity or perhaps the ability to transform themselves into a political setup that could articulate a political vision for the country, and then to have basically people on board. That's why we are seeing it clearly that what happens on the streets is there's an absence of a policy-making machinery, and it's basically people implementing what they think is the interpretation of Sharia, which they appear to understand as the only source of law and legislation in the society, and they're quickly also realizing that Afghanistan has changed. Afghanistan is not the same as as it was in the 1990s, and it's a very different country, and they have to very soon develop a much more complex ability to to focus on public services, to focus on how to engage the people, and also clearly remove this sort of cloak of repressive regime that's associated with them. Otherwise, from they, if they ever expected they would have a honeymoon period like any new governments tend to do, they didn't. They weren't given that opportunity, and they would not be. It will only get worse in the weeks to come. What will be a deciding factor is exactly going back to your specific question, in terms of whether they will then remain in power for, a duration of time or not. That will really depend on the second part of your question, which is the international and regional recognition. On that one, the picture is a little mixed. I think you have in the region countries like Pakistan and China, and some Arab countries like Qatar, who would be very willing to recognize them, even though the kind of government that they announced, and the fact that they've completely sort of turned their back on the whole sort of goal of inclusivity, which was something that everybody expected from them. That may even make it difficult for these regional countries to recognize them. Others in the region, like Iran and Russia, they've actually grown more skeptical in recent weeks, when they were actually rather positive before. India obviously is unengaged and will look at everything as in a very suspicious way, because they see this as being totally orchestrated by the Pakistani establishment. Now, in the West, there is some argument about having a pragmatic approach, because there is a humanitarian disaster that's looming on the horizon. Then some argue that maybe a recognition should be used as a leverage to not only engage them, but actually to try to change Taliban and try to soften their position, and work with them towards a joint responsibility, which is a humanitarian situation. But my own, I think, sort of more recently, the positions in the West have also become hardened, because they, I think so. What we might see is that there will be an engagement by United Nations and with a very specific focus on the humanitarian crisis. But I think recognition will probably not come anytime soon, because they need to see, and I think that's appropriate approach. Honestly, I mean, what we have argued as as Afghans in our conversations, but also as part of our think tank, to focus to basically offering some options in terms of moving forward. We've very strongly advocated for engagement, because shunning the Taliban at this stage and not engaging with them and would pin them into a corner, and would drive them increasingly into the control of the few that are in the region, like Pakistan and others who have links with them, and make the hardliners come basically remain in charge. So engagement is absolutely essential, but I think it shouldn't also go as far as basically giving blank checks. Conditionality of aid should be used in an intelligent way to effect some change on the Taliban side. But strictly, if you stopped engaging, then the Taliban will not succumb to pressure, to peer pressure. It goes completely against the way their mentality is set, especially at this stage when they feel that they've won the war and they deserve some sort of a recognition of that. And also, there is a religious thing as well, that they don't want to sacrifice what they feel a victory in the name of God, in their view, for some worldly reward, which is a recognition from others. And lastly, Afghan people would be the ones who would suffer at the end. So for these reasons, engagement is a key priority.
So the thing is, Jawed, I think one of the things that countries in the West, in the European Union, but also in the region are quite worried about, obviously, is the Taliban's treatment of women. And this recent ban on access to secondary education for girls is just one of the, let's say, points that is so alarming, not just for people in the West, but also for women in the region who have made great strides in terms of empowerment and access to education, access to jobs. I mean, all of this is quite contagious sometimes, isn't it? Because, an idea that spreads from one country to the other. So I was just wondering, I mean, why aren't countries in the region taking a stronger stance on women's rights? And why aren't Muslim countries in the region saying that, Sharia, their Taliban interpretation of the Sharia is not exactly the correct interpretation, and that, this is just one interpretation of Sharia and not the overarching one. I don't know why there is this silence in the region about the rights of women, which, are very prominent in Western minds.
I think that's a very good question, Shada. Really, and what has also been a huge disappointment that somehow the entire conversation of rights and freedoms is been sort of relegated to a Western sort of agenda, and thereby, that could easily be discredited as this sort of colonial hegemonic imposition of from the US and from the West, which is extremely unhelpful. The Afghan people, let's remember that the failure of the republic that we saw in the collapse of the republic on the 15th of August must not be equaled as a failure of the Afghan people to embrace democracy and freedoms. In fact, from the next day, from the second day of the Taliban's presence in Kabul, we saw protests emerging, and a lot of these protests have been driven by women groups, by youth organizations, and they are mostly purely for civic purposes. So they're not protests for food and price of goods. They are mostly, there are obviously those things as well that are important, but they're mostly for issues of freedom, rights, the color of the flag, and the name of the republic, for all. And in fact, over the last 4 weeks, there's hardly been a day that there isn't a protest somewhere in the country, and it's not just in Kabul. In fact, the first protest was in Herat, and then we saw in Kunduz. We saw protests for days in Kandahar, and obviously Kabul has been the scene of huge demonstrations. So this is to show that the Afghan people, who are very devoutly Muslim, they have embraced these things, and I think they deserve, therefore, recognition primarily from their own fellow Muslims in the region and beyond the region to actually stand for their rights. But that doesn't always happen. And I think really it's a question of the fact that they themselves, that most of these countries do not necessarily, sort of are accountable in the way that Western governments are to civil society pressures, and therefore they have to take issues of rights and freedoms very seriously and focus on them, whereas other countries can, and the governments have far greater sort of leeway in terms of pursuing a more sort of realist, realpolitik kind of agenda with the Taliban and with other countries. You know, and that's why what we've seen is that there is, you know, some do pay lip service to the fact that there should be inclusivity, for example. That's the one thing that's been supported. And Pakistanis have actually said that quite a lot over the last number of months and years. But we will see. We will see now that whether they will really indeed pressure the Taliban. My sense is that some, like China, for example, would probably prefer not to even talk about inclusivity or any of these other issues. They would just focus specifically on stability as a factor.
You're right. I mean, I think these are very strong concerns that we have. I also wanted to ask you, Jawed, about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. You alluded to it just now. But the point is, this country, your country, has received so much international assistance, including from the EU. I think it's the largest beneficiary of EU assistance in the world, almost 4 billion euros over the last 20 years or so. So I just am a bit puzzled, I have to say, and I think many people are, given all the money and the US and the Canada and everyone, you know, why are we facing this humanitarian crisis?
Well, no, it's a good question, but I think Afghanistan is and will remain for some time a poor country. And sadly, all the aid that was provided over these years has not really trickled down to sort of transform people's real livelihoods, and you know, and for the economy to prosper. Corruption has been a major factor, but it's also, I think, not just that. It's also the fact that fundamentally the whole aid industry that we saw in Afghanistan over the last 20 years was very much, extremely heavily sort of pivoted towards fighting the war. A very small fraction of the money that is usually being talked about has actually been invested in real economic development. And as a result, what we see is the fact that the country remains a poor country, and the people are hugely in need of immediate assistance. And the continued war in recent years, you know, other phenomena such as the COVID-19 pandemic have also, you know, contributed to the fact that there is right now a humanitarian disaster that's looming. That there are people, about half of the population, that's hungry, that will face the prospect of starvation, and then also obviously the collapse of economy right now. We have seen it was stagnant for many years already, and with what we are seeing right now, there's been a massive sort of disruption of economic activity now, and this, you know, for a subsistence economy like Afghanistan's, it has an immediate effect. People who had reasonable income until last month, but then are no longer employed, they're going to face huge hardship. There's no such thing as safety nets, as social safety nets, or you know, other opportunities for them to help. So that's why over the winter, sadly, you know, we are anticipating a dire sort of humanitarian situation to emerge. There, you know, this whole engagement, I hope, and will mean that there is now, you know, a government, whether we recognize it or not, a government in charge. And I think it would be useful to work with them to make them responsible, and make sure that some work is done between now and when the summer, the winter really arrives. Because otherwise, you know, it's going to could be quite severe. And also, my fear is that the humanitarian crisis will then feed into a political crisis as well, because Taliban are not going to take responsibility, of course. They will blame this on the West for politicizing aid. They will blame it on Western collaborators for undermining the so-called Islamic regime. So, what we might see is also, significant sort of crackdown by the Taliban as well, as a reaction to this.
Right. Thank you so much. I had just a couple of final questions. First of all, Jawed, that here in the EU, even as there's, focus on what's happening in Afghanistan and efforts to bring out people who have worked with the EU institutions, etc., bring them out, try and resettlement. The focus is very much on fears of a mass exodus of Afghans who will be seeking shelter and asylum in Europe. But as far as I know, this hasn't happened so far. Most of the Afghan refugees are fleeing to Pakistan and Iran. What do you think of these European fears and concerns about the arrival of Afghan refugees? Is it based on any reality, or is it also kind of, magical thinking on the part of the EU?
No, I think the fears are real because, if the humanitarian crisis is not averted and not tackled in Afghanistan, number one, and also if there isn't soon enough some sort of an economic sort of opportunity and the prospect of respectable livelihoods in the country. And finally, if we see continued repression by Taliban, and as I said, especially if that becomes worse once the humanitarian crisis really bites, then what running away is for safety is a natural thing that human societies have always done for millennia, and that's going to happen again. So I think that I think that you're right. The absolute majority of the outflows of refugees will go to Pakistan, to Iran and Pakistan, and perhaps to other neighboring countries like in the north. But to the extent that, for these, we've seen now, unlike in the 90s, right now, Afghanistan has had a significant sort of middle class group, people with reasonable income. So they would have the ability to go beyond. They would probably not want to or not be able to even feel safe in these neighboring places, and they would aim to arrive in Europe. Now,
right. Mm-hmm.
The possibility of sort of, erecting high walls and on the borders would be one thing, but I don't think that's very effective. The more effective thing would be to actually try to see if you could do something to before they leave in the first place.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's even more incentives, if you're right, for the European Union to, as you said, engage and make sure that there is economic development and some form of stability. So just the final question, really, Jawed, the EU is quite focused on Afghanistan, as I said to you, biggest aid beneficiary, but also, there is an EU connectivity plan, and Joseph Borrell, the EU High Representative, was in Tashkent in August at the Regional Connectivity Forum. So the EU has promised to stay the course, to stay engaged in Afghanistan, help especially women and children, and keep up its aid programs, but of course on conditions, as we talked about earlier. So looking at the EU and the role it could play in Afghanistan at the moment, do you think we should, as Europeans, keep to a safe policy of do no harm and then wait a bit before engaging in stronger ways than we have in the past? Or do you think there is scope for a real European, now, as you said, the Americans are unlikely to be present in the future, at least not in the way they've been. Do you think there's a role for Europe in stabilizing Afghanistan and in its economic development?
Well, that's a very important question, because the EU has obviously been a major contributor to economic development, to stabilization, to generally, I mean, the entire sort of engagement in the last 20 years would not have been possible without the EU participation. And now, as well, I mean, even though we saw there is a tendency, perhaps that some regional countries do that, to sort of clump together American engagement and European engagement as sort of one block. But the EU has this distinctive role. It has an image that's quite different inside Afghanistan, quite different from American engagement. Not to say that American engagement will not be required. Obviously, that will be necessary as well. But for Europe, there is role to play, not only in terms of economic recovery and humanitarian response, but also politically. I think politically, we expect that the Taliban would probably be much more open to engage with Europeans in general, and with the EU in particular. They would probably be more responsive to EU sort of messages. There is less sensitivity about that, and some in the Taliban, it's our information also shows that they have specifically asked for EU to play a more sort of dominant role now in terms of political engagement. They now, obviously, not to say that there shouldn't be any coordination in the sort of Western camp, but EU should also realize that it has quite distinct from the American role. They also have a significant role, and my advice would be that is focused right now on, number one, this whole principle of engagement and using aid conditionality as a leverage to effect change in the Taliban behavior and the Taliban sort of governing strategy, but also to in addition to that, to then really ensure that the humanitarian crisis is high on the agenda, because, as you said at the outset of this conversation, Shada, our attention spans are very, very short, and so Afghanistan may soon be forgotten, but it would be very useful if the EU, has a strategy that goes beyond just sort of the limelight, and that's much more enduring. And finally, one thing that I would specifically recommend for the EU to focus on would be this whole regional picture, because without the regional some sort of a regional approach, not only politically in terms of security of Afghanistan in the whole region, and finally also in terms of economic development, none of these would be possible unless you make the regional environment conducive, unless you address some of these regional issues that are there. And for that purpose, I think the role of some entity from outside is often very, very useful. And the United States is probably not in the best position to play any role there, because they have problematic relationships with, like with Iran, with Russia, with China. Whereas the EU, obviously the EU is also seen not always positively by some, but by and large, the region would be much more open to an EU sort of facilitative or mediation role, or some sort of a support role to get a regional approach in place.
Thank you very much indeed, Jawed Ludin. So very strong messages here from Jawed about Afghanistan's future, the regional context, the need for Europe and others to engage with the Taliban, among other things, to stave off a looming humanitarian disaster. Jawed, thank you so much for this engaging conversation. And for our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And make sure to keep up with the next episodes of the MENA Talks podcast. This is Shada Islam saying stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and North Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.